you see there for the captions is the correct link. We also, of course, have links to get both Spanish and French translations, and I hope you avail yourselves of them. I'd like to also remind everybody, as you seem to be doing very well, to keep yourselves muted unless you're speaking. And I think most of you will have an opportunity to ask questions. What I'd like you to do is please either say in the chat that you have your hand up, you'd like to ask a question. And I know last time a number of people actually typed their questions into the chat, and that's fine too if you'd like to do that. And this is the same for questions in English, en français, or en espagnol. And I also want to make sure everyone knows that this will be recorded. I'll state that again before we get started. This entire community forum will be recorded and will be available for the community to listen to and take notes. And we will be listening to it again ourselves to learn more from what has transpired. Thank you all very much. I'll be back again in a few minutes to open it up officially. It's now 1300 UTC, and I'd just like to thank everybody who's already here in attendance at the Internet Society's second quarterly community forum. Thank you all very much. A few housekeeping notes, and those of you who were on earlier have already heard this. There is a slide that hopefully all of you can see that will provide you the links for the English captions, for the French and Spanish simultaneous interpretations as well. I'm going to ask you to please continue to have your microphones muted until you're speaking. And I'd like you all to know that in order to ask a question or make a comment, all you need to do is type hand up, or I would like to make a comment, into the chat. And I and other question moderators will be tracking that and will take you in order that you put your information into the queue. One of the things that happened last time, which is very interesting, is that a number of you actually typed your whole questions into the queue. And if you're comfortable doing that, that's fine as well. I'd like to remind everybody that this is going to be recorded for future use by the Internet Society staff and our membership, and it's for their exclusive use. And we expect that there'll be a great deal of information to come from this, from your input. So let me just say again, thank you for all attending. Today we're going to be talking about protecting user data, which is quite a hot topic and connects very integrally to our campaign for building and restoring trust in the internet. Among the things that we'll be doing too is we will be working on the Global Internet Report, which will be focused on protecting user data and data breaches. One of the things we hope to do here is to get more information from you all, from our community, into avenues of inquiry and topics that should be in that Global Internet Report. So we're in advance of a lot of that work being done. This is an opportunity not just to hear about what's going on and from the perspective of our staff experts, but we want to make sure that we hear from our community experts as well, so that Global Internet Report is completely informed by you. So with that, thank you, and I'm going to turn it over now to Christine Runiger, our Senior Policy Advisor for Privacy and Security. Christine.
Thank you, Ted, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It really is a great pleasure to be talking with all of you all around the world. I can see lots of lovely faces there. And thank you to our interpreters. I will try to speak slowly so that you can keep up and it's not too hard. So I'm going to turn to my colleague Jeremy and ask for the slideshow. To get us started, what we thought would be useful is to sort of have a little bit of an introduction into privacy and data protection. And to do that, we've got some slides. And the first thing, while the slides are going up, next slide please, is just to remind everyone that one of our objectives in the 2006 action plan is to enable people to trust the privacy and security of their communication, actions and connections across the internet, while still ensuring the internet remains open and accessible. Slide. As Ted already mentioned, our Global Internet Report will address the economic dimension related to trust, specifically on personal data, and an issue that is close to the hearts of businesses, governments and consumers and internet users around the world, namely data breaches. Next slide, please. But first, we're going to do a very, very quick dive into personal data and privacy landscape. It's going to be very quick because there are a lot of issues that we could cover. Next slide, please. So first of all, most of you already know that when we talk about privacy and data protection, what we're usually talking about is information about an individual that is identified or identifiable. But what we're seeing is that the line between what is considered personal data from a legal point of view and what is not is getting very blurry. What we also see decisions aren't really matching their privacy attitudes in all cases. So why is that, we say? Well, in some cases it could be because convenience trumps privacy, or because they lacked a real and meaningful choice, and maybe they don't understand the services and privacy policies and practices. How many of you have noticed that many of the service providers have privacy policies that go for pages and pages and pages and pages in legalese? And what we also see that it's becoming increasingly easy to single out individuals from the noise using very sophisticated data analytics and correlation techniques. Next slide, please. So the other area that I wanted to touch on was personal data in a world of IoT with mobility and sensors, and to ask some questions for you to think about. Well, first of all, what impact will the Internet of Things have on individuals' privacy, particularly when you add in mobility and sensors? We also need to think about how can we effectively protect personal data in this scenario, and how do we mitigate against the privacy risks that sensor data may pose, especially when many still regard that sort of data as anonymous and not needing protection like personal data. Next slide, please. We're not going to be talking about surveillance today, but in the conversation of privacy and data protection, it's important to cover surveillance. For years, privacy advocates have warned us about commercial collection of personal data and its use. But it really wasn't until the Snowden documents became available that people really woke up to the risk of the use of their personal data being used for other purposes, and particularly by governments for security reasons. So what are some of the things that we've observed in this area? The first is that what we see is a lot of interest in what's called open source intelligence, so monitoring of publicly posted information. What we also heard from the Snowden documents is that there's been covert, mass, pervasive monitoring of private communications. We're also seeing challenges to data confidentiality and device security. We often refer to this as the encryption debate. And what we also see is great interest from entities that are involved in surveillance to collect and analyse vast quantities of metadata. Next slide, please. But we need to also think about, knowing what we do today about the surveillance that is occurring, what has this inspired? What has changed? Well, one of the things that we see is increased efforts to strengthen internet protocols, the internet infrastructure, applications and services against pervasive monitoring. There's very good work going on in the IETF and elsewhere. We also see an upsurge in new confidential communication services and end-to-end encryption being added to existing services. I'm sure you all heard that recently WhatsApp added end-to-end encryption. We also see among the general community a greater appreciation that even collection of personal data could be an interference with privacy. It's not just an interference of privacy at the point where the information is used. We also see that there are privacy risks associated with the collection and use of metadata. Importantly, there have been very significant political and policy declarations against mass surveillance, and we also see that data retention laws that were once taken for granted being challenged. Next slide, please. So what are some of the contemporary issues that we see? Oops, there's a bit of a sound issue. So what do we see as some of the contemporary issues beyond surveillance in the personal data protection space? There's a very long list, and I've only set out a few here. One is, of course, and it's frequently in the news, about the EU Privacy Shield, EU-US Privacy Shield. That is, of course, how do you deal with personal data crossing national borders? There's also a lot of interest in how can we do a better approach towards protecting privacy by looking at it through the privacy risk management lens. There's also interest in legalising or giving users a legal right to data portability. We see that in the new EU General Data Protection Regulation and also in the Philippines law. Then, of course, today the issue that we're going to focus on is data breaches, but there's also the right to be forgotten, which is very important to many people in Europe and Latin America. Next slide, please. Next slide. So just as a bit of an introduction to what Michael's going to say about data breaches, I thought it'd be interesting to see what the trends are. So I did a search of security breach versus data breach using Google Trends. And you'll see, interestingly, that last year, people are searching more and more for information about data breach than security breaches. This tells me that data breach is a very important and very urgent issue for businesses, governments, and users alike. Next slide, please. And as a taste for our conversation today, I just thought it was useful to highlight a couple of the issues from the user's perspective and to ask you all to think to yourselves, have you ever received a data breach notification? You'll see from one study from one country that approximately 43% of the population has reported receiving a data breach notification. And interestingly, many of them find out from another source rather than an official notification. Next slide, please. And the other question one needs to ask is, having found out that there's been a data breach, do consumers go elsewhere? And again, this is only a study from one country, and it's only one study, but it's interesting if you look at the slide at how many people still continue to do business with the company. Now, there may be any number of reasons for this, and that's perhaps something we could talk about today. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Michael Kendi, who's our Chief Economist, and he's going to take us through data breaches in the context of the Global Internet Report.
Thank you. Thank you. Next slide, please. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for participating. As Ted mentioned, this is really for us to take input into the report. I'll present a few slides setting up the report as we see it for this year. And then I'd really like to hear from all of you about your experiences and your thoughts and comments on where we're headed. So just briefly, by way of introduction, the topic for this year's report is going to be the economics of trust. The plan is to release it sometime in October. We haven't fixed that down. It'll be a standalone release, not tied to any particular event. And we'll obviously provide more details as we have them going into the summer in September. Overall, it's going to be similar to last year's report in that we're going to definitely have an online version as well as the printed one. We'll also have one for mobile devices and make sure that there's one that's easy to print out for people to print out the PDF as well. Also, it'll be relatively similar in structure and analysis. There'll be a data section highlighting the issues, setting up the analysis and the rest of the report, some case studies to illustrate really what are the impacts of these data breaches, what are some illustrations of some particular trends that are taking place. Then it'll highlight what the issues are, and finally have some recommendations about what can be done about it. In terms of input, we've started very early taking an input. There's 3 working groups. There's an internal one with a number of my colleagues. There's one with the organizational members. And finally, there's one with a chapter. There's a chapter working group. And I see a few of you are on this chat. And thank you again for all your participation and help with the report so far. We have monthly meetings. Next one is scheduled for next week. And it's been very, very valuable so far in providing input. And then there's this call, this forum, and I think there's going to be I'm looking forward to very good input here, and also any follow-up at my email address. If we couldn't get to your question or if some other thoughts come to you later, please, by all means, let me know, and I'd love to have a chat about that offline. Next slide, please. So the topic overall is the economics of trust. What do we mean by that? Online activities are increasingly rely on users to provide personal data, whether it's financial, health, location, data that comes in search queries or other. And that's how we increasingly use the internet. And all of this, of course, is based on trust. And if you look forward to, let's say, the Sustainable Development Goals, they foresee ICT and the internet as an enabler for all sorts of goals in banking, health, and a number of other uses that will require personal data as well. So it's very, very important that people have trust in the internet to increase their usage and come online. And looking forward, there's increasingly going to be Internet of Things devices that will gather sensitive information about us, sometimes with our knowledge and sometimes without. And again, we really have to have trust in that. So the idea is that unintended usage or release of the data, particularly through data breaches, can have a significant impact on us as users. First, there's a direct impact on those whose data is misused. That can be a financial one, that can be a social one, or otherwise, but there's clearly a significant impact of these breaches. We heard a few tragic cases where people whose records were released in the Ashley Madison database committed suicide because of the stigma of having been in that list. Others, it's financial, that someone takes over their identity and things like that. So there can be a significant direct impact, but there can also be an indirect impact even on those who aren't breached as they hear more and more about this, they may be more and more hesitant to trust the internet and use the internet for the new services. So for that reason, the user perspective is really central to this report, addressing threats to our willingness to use online services and emerging Internet of Things services. Next slide. So from the user perspective, there's an increasing number of users are directly impacted by data breaches. There's a lot of sources and a lot of reports. One of them said last year in 2015 alone, 707 million records were breached. And those are just the ones that are publicly known. Not all countries require notification. So 770 million and 7 million people were impacted by breaches last year, some more than once, of course. So that has a significant impact. And then there's just an increasing drumbeat of publicity, particularly for the bigger breaches. The same source said 46 of these breaches have more than 1 million records. And so when we read about this and hear this, it increasingly creates uncertainty and nervousness about what might happen to our own data. And it's starting to show up in reports. The SIGI Ipsos report that was just released last week indicated that 83% of global users who were interviewed have changed their online behavior as a result of what they're hearing, and they're worried about how their data might be abused online. From the organization perspective, there's an increased cost of prevention, detection, and insurance against breaches before the breach. One study shows that the cybersecurity industry alone is worth $75 billion today and growing very, very fast. What you can't see, the second bullet there is after the breach, there's direct costs of cleaning up the breach, there's a loss of customers, there's a potential impact on stock price for the organization, so there's a significant cost. One study that IBM commissioned showed a cost of about $154 per record breached, and that is also coming up fast. So more records being breached and an increased cost. So the question that's really driving this report, and the one that's going to be interesting to answer, is given the impact that this is having on customers' own, on companies and organizations' own consumers, on citizens, on employees whose records are breached. Given this direct impact, why does the number and size of data breaches seemingly just continue to grow? And one answer to that, I suppose, is an economic one, that organizations may not be bearing the full cost of the data breach. In economic terms, there may be an externality, so companies aren't spending as much on preventing breaches as would be optimal. Companies don't bear the cost of everybody's uncertainty and decreasing willingness to use the internet, for instance, but this would be a great topic to raise during the discussion in a moment. And the final slide, just a few issues to potentially discuss. And this really looks at the issue from a variety of perspectives: the organizational perspective, the technology available, the government perspective, and the missing bullet there at the bottom would be the user perspective. So first, one issue might simply be, as the cost of storage falls and as companies increasingly are able to collect data, are they gathering too much data in a sense? Or should they try and minimize the amount that they're gathering to prevent the cost of breach going up? So for instance, Target was breached several years ago. 70 million records, including credit card numbers, were breached. And Target had been storing the customer's PINs alongside the credit card number. And many people think there was no need for that, but they had the PINs, so they were storing them. And of course, that made the breach much, much worse. So that's an issue. Is effectively the value of the data less than or than the cost if it's breached, is one thing to consider. Second, are the causes of the breaches well understood? Is the technology lacking, or are enterprises simply not doing enough to protect themselves? Verizon every year puts out a report on data breaches and said for last year, based on their analysis, 70% of breaches could have been prevented because they were based on known vulnerabilities, that companies simply hadn't patched up vulnerabilities that were known in the software that they were using. So the question is, why weren't they doing that if the information was available and given the potential cost of a breach? Third, should governments take more action to protect users from data breaches? One thing that's commonly discussed is whether there should be software liability. And this is not just for databases, but increasingly with the Internet of Things, there's software embedded in a lot of devices. So Jeep recently had one of its cars were hacked based on internet-connected entertainment system. And effectively, the same liability that would have applied if it was a defective design of the car, or if it was an unsafe steering wheel or acceleration problem, the same liability they claimed didn't apply to this breach. So they faced less liability for the car being taken over and hacked by someone else than they would for another safety issue. So that might be a way to address it if the companies or organizations aren't able to raise the liability and effectively increase the cost of the breach. And finally, the fourth bullet that is hidden there, unfortunately, can users take actions to protect themselves from data breaches? That's a very open question. Are there things that we can do short of just simply not using the internet? We obviously want everyone to be online and use the internet, but are there other actions that consumers or users can take to protect themselves? So again, just in terms of the discussion, are there some case studies that highlight the good practices and bad practices that people want to flag? Do any of you have any personal experience with a breach? And I'll leave it on this. I think that this personal experience can really bring it home. I haven't had one my own, but I was with my mother-in-law, 82 years old, who was a TalkTalk customer in the UK. And I was visiting when the TalkTalk breach became known, and it was very disconcerting for her. She had no idea. There wasn't enough information available. The website effectively went dead. They didn't want people logging in. So there was really no way of knowing, and it really brought home that these breaches really have a deep personal impact on those, because